Hello, and welcome to the Merri-Cast, the show that puts you on the fast track to business confidence. My guest this week is Felicity Cowie. She's been a journalist for many years, and she's worked for the BBC, ITV, and has gone on to use her skills in her business life, so I can really relate to many of the things she says in this interview. She describes her entrepreneurial journey as a bit of a muddle, but to my eyes, she's done pretty well with it. Not only running a successful media consultancy, but also becoming a successful business author. She was recently shortlisted in the recent Business Book Awards. Let's hear the story, though, in her own words.
Well, I always knew that I wanted to spend like a really big part of my life writing and storytelling. I knew that from a child. And surprisingly, as a child, I had grasped the concept that if I was going to spend my time, a large chunk of my life doing that, I was going to have to find a way of making it pay. That I was going to need to earn money from it. So when I was really young, I would write articles for like comics and stuff like that, and I'd enter writing competitions. I mean, the money you won was so little, but then of course, that seemed a lot to me, like to win £5 or whatever, like for a letter. But then I started working for local papers as well when I was at school and when I was a student. So they were in two different towns. So I actually had kind of built up quite a portfolio, as you would call it now. I had no idea I was really doing that, but that's what happened. So then I was offered traineeships, which was an amazing thing back in the mid to late 90s, which are much harder to get now, I know. I was very blessed, but yeah, I was offered two traineeships actually with two local newspapers, and I picked the one that at the time was very, very difficult. It was known as the SAS of newspaper journalism. It was a very challenging course, but it really, and I found it very hard, and I was not very good, I don't think, but it did stand me in incredibly good stead. And so I was sponsored by the Kent Messenger Group, and so I did their training course, and then I went to work for them for a couple of years. And that was, at that point, I had like learnt quite a lot, I suppose, up to that point.
Did you have any moments of doubt that that's what you wanted to do? I mean, if it was an SAS style kind of course, were there moments where you thought, I can't get up and do this again, or
Yeah.
that, or were you always thinking, I'm just going to push on through, and this is definitely what I want?
No, I mean, I really found it difficult. And it was the SAS bit of it was only 20 weeks. And then you went back to your paper and you worked for another 2 years or thereabouts. And those 20 weeks in amongst it, I was poorly, I think, for a week with flu or something. And I really fell behind because it was, and I was just awful at shorthand. I mean, and that was, you had to pass shorthand. It was incredibly strict. So yeah, I would say probably like my entire career I've been fueled on self-doubt, because it's like, so, I mean, who isn't in a way maybe, but I do look back on these things and think, how the hell did I keep going? I don't think I felt I had any choice really. And obviously the brilliant thing of getting a sort of a traineeship is, it does give you a big boost, but then it is this sort of thing that you have to sort of, you don't want to fail at it really. So I suppose fear of failure was kind of offset with self-doubt. So I kind of muddled through with all of that. But I mean, the course itself was absolutely fantastic. There was 29 of us on it. We really got on as a group, and it was very sociable as well. So yeah, I don't know, maybe it's sort of rose-tinted glasses, but I do look back on some of it and just think it was a very stressful, but also like a very funny time. And I do feel to this day like enormous amounts of gratitude to the tutor. In fact, I'm still in contact with. In fact, the book that I've written, he actually has written a section of the book, and my tutor from the course, and the first editors I had when I worked at the newspaper, for the amount of time and effort they put into me when I, was so rubbish, like at what I was doing. But, really key lessons that have really stood me in good stead, and which I pass on to my clients all the time now.
I think one of the most important things that I was trained in, I mean, listeners will know that I'm a journalist turned entrepreneur. I wouldn't sure quite how to describe myself, but one of the things I learned most, I think, from doing a lot of journalism was about putting yourself in the other person's shoes.
Yeah.
And, in terms of the interviewee, and actually that served me quite well from a business perspective. And I then later went on and set perspective. Did you have a sort of sense of that in your sort of fledgling journalism career at that stage, or were you sort of at that point, was your awareness all about meeting deadlines, getting scoops, and so on? Because there's different sort of shades of journalism, or were you always a sort of emotionally intelligent journalist who was thinking about, how must the interviewee be thinking?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because it is like once it's a bit like, when you're driving a car at first, there's just so many things to think about. You're almost just in these little pockets of thought everywhere, aren't you? And then it's only once you can actually drive, you start to kind of think, oh, I might just hang back a bit from that person because they don't really know like what they're doing and all this kind of stuff. And yeah, I mean, honestly, I really was not a good trainee. I mean, I tried really hard, and I do remember them saying, you're the hardest. We've never seen anybody try as hard as you, but really, like, the shorthand thing was particularly bad. And it had a knock-on effect of confidence because I couldn't fundamentally get that right. And I felt I was always playing catch-up. Even when I started my job, I was having to do these evening classes to try and catch up with this blooming thing. So I would say at first, I was so worried about getting it wrong. I suppose it's a sort of selfishness in a way, isn't it? Like, it was pretty hard to think of anything beyond just keeping my job. But I think the thing for me, though, that has so informed like what I do now with people was what I almost found this safety net through it all, which was, I remember like almost on day one of journalism, this SAS training course thing, we were taught like that journalists always needed to ask 6 questions. And our trainer, not Peter, another trainer called Robin, he talked about these 6 cones of investigation, which I think must be his phrase because I've Googled this and I've never seen anybody else come up with this. And his idea being that you ask these questions and underneath the cone reveals all the answers. And the 6 things are the who, what, why, where, when, and how. And that's a technique that the police are taught, and I think Aristotle writes about it. It's not specific to my journalism course. It's a very human thing to want to ask and get answers to those questions. But in this kind of like terrifying, like I would go to court and I would come back and they'd be like, right, we want your story in an hour. And I'd be like, oh, like I don't know what story to write. I've been sitting through several different court cases all day. And I would just remember this magical like who, what, why, where, when, and how thing, and just use it to calm myself down almost and think, right, how do I answer these questions? Give myself some focus. And I think that's kind of what got me through. And then I would go and interview people, and no matter if it was, and even later on in my career, when it was frankly people I was really quite intimidated by, or, things like, say, when I worked at Panorama, we really needed to get to the heart of stuff. Again, these 6 questions things would be my kind of guardrails almost.
Yeah.
And I would go there thinking it'll be okay, just ask these 6 questions. And now I teach people this all the time when they're nervous about communication, is use these 6 questions, fall back on them.
I totally agree. I mean, I had a similar sort of training, and I found those questions are very useful outside of journalism as well. And the other 2 I was taught were, apart from those 6, was when you're really stuck, is to say what happens next, or what does the future hold? So
Yes.
I can't think what else to ask.
Well, people do like answering that question, and our teacher as well. And this has always been my experience, and I bet it was yours as well. Is that he would say that as soon as you shut your notebook, because it was print, or if you turn off the recorder or the camera or whatever like that, people always say, oh, just one other thing, and then they say something absolutely astonishing that you would have were trying to get out of the whole conversation. Yeah. So he said, be very aware, like allow like the little space at the end where the person themselves suddenly clicks in what they really, really want to tell you. And that was really, really good advice. He sort of likened them to a bit, not you, but the interviewee, to being a bit like Columbo almost, like, oh, just one last thing. Then they come out with this killer, amazing quote, and you'd be like, okay, we'll just turn the camera back on.
Yeah. No, I totally get. By the way, I'm a fellow sufferer from shorthand to this day. I still don't think I've recovered from that sort of thing. But tell us about how you came to be at the BBC. So there you were in your sort of SAS stroke intensive training, and then tell us about that journey, if you like, that got you there.
Well, it was quite a simple journey, really.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So this is all this is what happened. So I was working at the Kent Messenger. I'd done my training. I'd been there for, I think, coming up for 2 years, which was the sort of the training period. I'd done loads there. I really liked working there, but I think that I guess I was like 22 or something at that point, and I really wanted to go to London to work. I had always really wanted to go to a big city anyway, and all of us were, I was one of like 4 trainees, astonishingly, so we were all quite ambitious, and they were all ahead of me because they had done the course before me, so they're all leaving. So I thought, well, I'll just look and see what I could do next. And there was just an advert in The Guardian, which was the place to look for media jobs back in, I'm not actually sure if that's quite so true anymore, but there was a supplement and it would come out and you'd look through it. And there was an advert in The Guardian to work for the BBC in Southampton as a broadcast journalist, which is the sort of entry-level journalist, if you've had journalism training role. So I just applied for it thinking, well, I know I won't get it, but it will show willing and a foot in the door, and it's a chance to just find out about it. So that's what I did. But then I did get offered the job and I accepted it. And so that's what happened. And I I worked in Southampton for, I think maybe about, I can't remember, maybe 14, 18 months, but all the time I was kind of like really keen to go to London. So there was an opportunity to do that because again, it was a proper job and I had an interview for it and all this kind of stuff. But they have a thing, they still have it to this day in the centre, the main newsroom in London, where they provide bulletins of national news, but for all the regional news stations, so that they don't have to, you haven't got every regional news station writing the national news on top of their local news. It's just a more efficient thing. And because I'd been writing the news bulletins all the time for the local radio station, I was using this. I had good relationships with them. I knew how it all worked. So it's not an uncommon route for a regional journalist to go into or it wasn't back then. Then once I was in, that was kind of like it. Things really took off then because it was incredible. It was back when the main news operation was in Television Centre, and I was, the most junior and inexperienced broadcasting person in the room of 200, 400 people. It was a massive room of people. But my desk was like, I sat with all the other people who wrote the radio news bulletins. So I'm writing this stuff for all the regions, but everybody else around me is writing the bulletins for like Radio 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Then there's like a tiny kind of aisle between me and the 6 o'clock news team. And there, so, like about, I don't know, like less than 5 meters, like a couple of meters, like between me and Hugh Edwards, who's just sitting there, like typing away, chatting away, an amazing, journalist. So it was kind of like all around me. So it was very easy in a way, once I'd got over how incredibly intimidating it all was, to sort of start to kind of, you could physically see them doing their work. And of course, we're all really writing versions of the same news and discussing it to some extent. So it was easy then to start to move around. And I worked for pretty much every news offering the BBC had, like radio and television. So I worked for all the news bulletins, radio news bulletins, but then I worked for News 24, as it was called back then, now the BBC News Channel, and then finally at Panorama.
And so was it a planned path for you, or were you just sort of like just looking at thinking, oh, there's a vacancy there, and just kind of hopping around trying to get as much experience? Was there method in the madness, I suppose I'm saying?
No, it didn't feel very methodical. It felt quite sort of confused. I mean, it all telling this backwards all sounds like really like how straightforward and whatever. It all felt fairly chaotic. And I mean, I have to be honest, like some of the the shifts where I was writing the hourly news bulletins, that sounds cool, doesn't it? But actually sometimes when there wasn't very much happening, it was so boring. Like an hour can feel a very long time when you've kind of like sort of written your stuff and nothing much is happening, whatever. So, but then I suppose because of that, there was a lot of time to interact with other people. I think I'm just quite curious about things, and I obviously have this bizarre kind of like obsession with writing and how people write. So I that would help me overcome some of I just was fascinated about how are you doing that? How is that? How are those words? Why are you writing differently for television than from radio and things like that? So I think the craftsmanship of it and the fact that we sometimes had time to sort of share and things like that. But the BBC is it is very strict. It's very competitive. It's very hard to move around. And yes, you can do bits and pieces there, but there's always other people who want to. Getting formally kind of like moved into a different role is quite difficult. Yeah, so there are a lot of opportunities there, and you're all in this one room. But yeah, the moving around thing was, it was hard. And in fact, I did leave. I went to work for ITV for a bit in the middle of all of this because they started a 24-hour news channel, and I went to work for them for a year or so, and then lots of us turned freelance, and then we were sort of doing a mixture of ITV and BBC shifts at the same time. So yeah, I don't want to kind of like, and there was a lot of uncertainty around doing that, sort of giving up staff contracts to go and freelance and all this kind of stuff. So yeah, it was, I guess it was just taking opportunities really as they arose.
So this was the beginning of, I suppose, if you were freelancing, this was the beginning of self-employment, where you were starting to sort of do shifts or gigs and so on like that. At that stage, did you think about it in terms of, I run my own business, or were you thinking I'm a freelance journalist? I mean, what was your sort of mentality at that point?
Well, interestingly, at that period of time, so it was around about 2000, 2001, so I was doing freelance shifts for ITV and for BBC across loads of the BBC's different things as well, because they obviously have a massive thing. ITV just had this one thing. But at the same time as well, and this was all declared, and nobody seemed to have a problem with it, although I do wonder about this. I was also like working for some of the London boroughs, the London councils, on their what happens if they have a crisis and how to deal with like a preparation for like dealing with the media and stuff like that. So it wasn't like I was just a freelance journalist. I actually had started to add this other element in where I was doing media training and I was doing proactive and reactive campaign stuff for them and things like that. There never seemed to be a conflict of interest, but you can see the potential for that to go a bit wrong. And I did like that. I liked that there was something about that, as I said, the BBC, like a lot of large companies, it's their rules kind of thing when it comes to progression, what money you can ask for, all that kind of stuff. There was something really quite exciting about doing freelance stuff, especially for the boroughs where you could much more negotiate fees and day rates and all, and just choose the projects you wanted to work on and all of that. I liked the freedom of it. But saying all of that, I actually did end up going back to the BBC on another staff contract because I got to the point where I was doing so much work for them, and some of it was the politics stuff out of Millbank and outside broadcasts and covering party conferences. And for all of that, they were like, right, this is... so I went back on a staff contract and I stayed there for another 5 or 7 years, something like that. So I didn't... So yes, it planted a seed, but I did still go back into the big sort of like staff like world again. Yeah,
I did something similar because I left. I was at Haymarket, and then I left Haymarket and did my own freelance work for a while, and then I went back to Haymarket because they were offering me editorships of various sort of magazines, and I thought, well, I've never done that before. I'd love to do that, and so you go back in for a bit more experience. But then when I came out, I found I had more experience, almost like a higher orbit, if you like, for starting a freelance career. So when did you come to sort of leave the BBC sort of proper? And did you at that stage go straight to your own business from there?
No, so actually I took a sabbatical from, I was working at Panorama and I sort of took some time out there and I went to do a creative writing MA at Bath Spa because it's something when I left, when I stopped being a student, I had always had this slight niggle of like, I'd wanted to carry on and do an MA, but then because I was offered these traineeships at the paper, so I was in this really kind of like wonderful, very lucky position really, where I had lots of choices. But I really wanted to earn money, and obviously doing an MA, I just couldn't see how I could really fund it, and whatever. But it was that hankering was kind of there. I had felt I hadn't finished with academia and with creative writing as well. So the Bath Spa thing, I started to do that. And then after I'd done that, it kind of broke the spell a bit. Then I just thought, the jobs that I had as a journalist, it were really dependent on being in London, which I absolutely loved. But I had grown up outside of London. So now I had this other, I don't know. So I don't know if I sort of took a big formal decision of like, I am now going to do something else. It's just that kind of period of like, I might not go back yet, kind of got more and more extended to the point where then it was like, okay, right, no, that's not happening. So then I started to do, actually for a time I worked on a novel and I was enjoying doing sort of creative writing and stuff. But then a concert venue that I went to that was very near my house, were looking for somebody to help them work with the media. And and a friend of mine worked there, and it sort of slightly organically turned into that. So I went there to help out and did that for a bit. And that was sort of the beginning of me not being a journalist anymore and actually helping businesses work with the media and then help with their, and more broadly with how they communicated with their stakeholders and things like that.
Yeah. So in terms of that the sort of journey then that you're doing, and then starting to do lots of different bits of work at that point. And did you sort of see it in a sort of business perspective, like I've got to make this amount of money and I'm doing this and I'm going to market myself in this way and so on. Were you looking at it as a sort of through a kind of somebody who wasn't an out and out journalist at that point of view, or were you starting to think of it in a sort of more commercial sense at that point?
I think, I kind of went on until about like 2017, like doing this sort of communications, like such a huge umbrella, but this communications work. I wasn't really doing any work as a journalist, I don't think. And this communication stuff. And sometimes I would work like in-house with people, or like I'd work via an agency, or I'd have my own clients. It was a real mixture of everything. I think but yes, I was like classed as self-employed for some of this work. Some of it was PAYE. So yeah, it was a right old muddle. But in 2017, I did some work for a bank and it was all done. And I invoiced them and they were like, oh, you are a limited company, aren't you? Otherwise, we can't pay you. And I'm like, oh. So like, I literally set up a limited company that night to resend my invoice to get paid for this job that I had done. So my start into having a company that feels incredibly unstrategic, really, and it literally was just like a payment mechanism, I would say, because I had other work going on at the same time as I'd been making this film. It was a film that I made for this bank. I was doing this other work that was also PAYE. So I think what probably the story that's emerging here is it was all a bit of a muddle, a bit of a like take opportunities where they are, and start a business kind of like on the hoof, because that was the only way to really get like
You'd be amazed, Felicity, about the way people have started, limited companies. Your story is much more common than you may possibly imagine, that people who did it, oh God, do I really have to? And, sort of do it and do that, set that thing. Also, I've interviewed people who, rather than having some big strategic master plan, actually were annoyed with their bosses, got drunk down the pub, maxed out their credit cards, and woke up the next morning, thought, well, I've got to do something about it now. And that person, by the way, became a multimillionaire. But it wasn't exactly a model, where
it's
doing
maybe not. It's a bit of a risk. I think, but the economic imperative is like always there. I've never been a person with like money to fall back on. So I do think that has been a driving thing of what I've done. I mean, I might have built up the odd sort of bit of money and thought, okay, right, I've got a bit of, I mean, I am a bit of a believer in that, is that if you can kind of like just take, I think you have to be a believer in this if you're a small business, otherwise you just can't cope. You have to somehow get your head around the thing which is difficult, which is the feast or famine thing. So you're really, really busy. The money's, as long as you've got decent clients and all this, the money's coming in, and then it kind of, especially if you're a solopreneur as well, like that's all happening, then that ends, and then you're like, right, I need to get the next gig, and there's this downtime in between getting them, and you think, oh well, I've tried so many times since 2017 to sort of like narrow that gap, that downtime thing, but it is very, very difficult when you've got a very absorbing piece of work that you're doing to get other things going along, bubbling alongside it. It is an ongoing challenge. So so I've certainly had that where I've thought, right, just I've had to get more comfortable with, okay, lots of money has come in, but now that's sitting there and that is going down because I'm like waiting to get the next lot in. And I think I've always been quite lucky in that I've managed to make that work just about, but it does get squeaky. And everybody I know who starts a business has that.
Yeah. And I guess you talked about narrowing down that gap, and I completely relate to that. I mean, there's a real pain point, isn't there, when you're intensively involved in a project, but you also know that if I don't do some new business or answer those emails about that inbound inquiry like that, then I'm going to regret this in about 3 or 4 weeks' time. And I can't say I've ever totally mastered that, but I guess I'm sort of listening to I failed countless times to listen to that voice. And now I'm sort of getting better at listening to that. What would you say? I want to get onto your book exposure, because I want to let the listeners know about that, because it's a fantastic book. But let's just on the business side of things. I mean, let's start with, what are you worst at in running your own business? I mean, is it that you were speaking about that new business, current business cycle, or are there other things? For me, it's things like accounts and the money side of things. But what is it for you? And how do you deal with it? How do you sort of try and lessen the loss, if you like?
I think the difficulty of like working with a client and then lining up the next load of work is, I've come to be very self-forgiving about that. It's just not my fault. Like the industry that I work in, and maybe this is true, I mean, this is possibly true of everything, because this is maybe human behavior rather than behavior around communications, is that people will contact me and they'll be like, can you start next week? And I'll be like, no, because, I'm already like agreeing to do something. However, I would love to do this. Let's have a chat. Let's make it happen. Like, not next week, but like 2 weeks after that. But then it's just like they've left it too late. This is a thing people do with communications anyway. They'll get you in, seeing you as the end, sort of like magician. And I, it is just a thing that happens. So I've kind of tried to be a lot kinder to myself about that. It's not like not making the attempts to kind of to get this next thing lined up. It's just people are very, very much like, they just want you in front of them right there and then. But the thing that I think I do, I've had lots of interesting thoughts about this actually, even in the last couple of weeks. I think my main sort of like challenge I have is that and I think this will be familiar to loads of people, is that I will go along with a very clear brain and lots of clarity and focus and momentum. And I just feel like, oh, I love this. I really know what I'm doing, blah, blah, blah. And then it just suddenly sort of by degrees sort of starts to become more foggy, more uncertain, confusion comes in, self-doubt, all this kind of stuff. But what I started to realize about this is, and then I get to the point where, and I think it's my sort of personality, where the energy will really start to drop, and I will I'll go from being this almost like kind of two people, like very, very busy and very focused, to kind of like, I just want to sit and watch Law and Order or like 5 USA all day, like and I have to, oh, for God's sake, like keep this energy up, which is another way of kind of, I've realized, of torturing yourself. And actually somebody pointed this out to me, I think it was only last week. It was such a revelation for me, so I think it might be useful to share it. Was that they said confusion is actually very efficient. And I was like, because what bothers me, I think, is my lack of efficiency at times. And I thought, efficient, and they were like, well, yeah, because you've realized subconsciously or in a, that something is not really working, or it's time to move on or reconfigure or put your energy in a different place and adapt. But you're kind of like lagging a bit with that. So basically your body's just gone, nah, and it's just like stopped, it has gone into this confusion things, because things need to be thought through, and less energy needs to be spent on this, what was sort of all this, this clarity is no longer kind of like relevant. And I think there's most definitely a kind of it feels safe, and I guess it's an ego thing to feel like you really know what you're doing. And I mean, obviously, who's not going to love that feeling of like mental clarity and you're just being so productive? And it's almost the loss of that is a bit like, oh no. But I think, and that can be really painful actually, and I've got really stuck on that sometimes. But I think actually, if we can just see that, oh no, okay, actually what's happening here, it's almost like second brain is kind of like kicking in and going, no, this is coming to an end now, and now we need to think again. And actually I'm sort of protecting you by stopping you wasting energy on something that's over, but we're now going to take the energy down. We're going to have to slow our thinking down and really look at stuff. So I'm not saying it's pleasant, it's really painful, but actually that's been really useful to realize that.
Yeah, I totally get that. It's almost like at the moment where I've learned to be a bit, self-forgiving is a great phrase, because, that you use there, because I think there's a lot of journalist mentality in me still that is that I'm thinking about the deadline and the immediacy of things, and what's the next deadline. And actually, if you've had a heavy meeting, with a client or something, probably the best thing to do is after the meeting, you just get up and walk around the park for half an hour or something, and almost the time when you feel right, I've got to do 50 things as a result of that meeting, is actually no, I just get up and I just wander around and slow down. At the time when a lot of my journalistic instinct from training would be to speed up. And so I've had to sort of untrain myself a little bit in that way. But confusion is very efficient. I love that. Is that actually it's a good way of saying, your brain telling you that something's not quite right, and you have to sort of stop and actually think, well, how do I get back to the clarity that you mentioned again? Yeah.
Well, I think it's just such a brilliant way of thinking about it, because I think what can happen is that we can really personalize confusion and get quite sort of like, oh, I've got brain fog and this is not helping me, I'm not helping myself. And you can really, really be quite mean to yourself about all of that kind of thing. But then I think, seeing it is like, I mean, this is like, to any scientist listening to this, massive apologies, but from my vague understanding of some of the neuroscientists that I have worked with, is like we're conscious of about 20% of what's going on and what and of our own thoughts. And so there's a whole load of other thinking and planning and strategizing, whatever, that is going on that we're not very conscious, we're not conscious of at all. And I just wonder if, this confusion thing is somewhere in between that, where like there's stuff emerging, and it's like and that's why it's so painful, because we like to know what we're doing. So the 20% thing feels like quite safe, even if it's uncomfortable thinking. It's still like, well, I know what I think. This whole hinterland of like, now I'm confused, I don't know what's going on, is awful. Especially when you have your own business, and I think especially if you're just the only person in your business, you can feel so vulnerable, thinking, God, like I don't have a functioning brain, like and I need to like keep going and earn money. So I started to sort of think this confusion thing is like really interesting if it's looked at as a kind of a way of your brain like refilling with like what's going to happen next, but it's just that sort of process has to take place.
Yeah, I think it's a brilliant look at about those kind of everyday doubts, and and the act of self-forgiveness is I think essential, because you have to get up each day and just carry on anyway. I mean, the shortcut to resilience is that self-forgiveness, I think. But I want to talk about your book, Exposure: Insider Secrets to Make Your Business a Go-To Authority for Journalists. Now, as an ex-journalist sort of myself, I really related to a lot of the things that you put in. But tell me what it was that made you want to write it in the first place, and whether that was a labor of love or just a labor, as you were going through it, because I know writing a book is
Yeah.
is a very difficult thing to do. So tell me about what made you want to write it, and how you found the process of doing so, and what's been the reception. I know it's shortlisted for a Business Book Award recently.
Yes, it was. Yeah, so I was writing posts on LinkedIn, just giving people tips about how journalists think, because I've been sort of helping people work with journalists since about 2010, I guess. And it really astonished me how people would just make these assumptions about journalists that were completely false, and would be either too trusting or too afraid of them, like without, and would pitch stuff at them, which like no newsroom on planet Earth would be able to do. So I thought, I'll just do a kind of some insights of like, this is what journalists think when you phone up and say this or whatever. And a friend of mine was like, you should put this stuff in a book, because you're kind of just sticking it all on LinkedIn, and it would be better if it was, it was in a book, because it's really valuable. And so she had a book published by a publisher, and so she pointed me in their direction. And the publisher, which was Practical Inspiration Publishing, was running this 10-day business book proposal challenge, which I think they run it 3 or 4 times a year. So I did that, and the prize of that proposal challenge was to win a publishing contract. So that's what happened. So in 10 days, I kind of went from like, here's some ideas like for a book, following a very clever template that was on this course. So I'd filled the template, I'd done it all. Then the publisher picked the winner, and it was me. So I suddenly like had a proposal to write a book, a contract to write it. And I was like, and of course, with this whole obsession with writing and books and everything, I was like completely delighted, because trying to publish fiction, which I've tried to do, is so different, because you have to go via agents and whatever. So I couldn't really quite believe it at first. I was like, what? It was like a publisher's contract kind of just like appeared in my email, and I'm like, this is amazing. But then I took a decision to I could take 7 weeks out of the client work that I was doing, because as we've been describing, there was this kind of boom and bust, and I could sort of see, this is about to come to an end. I could take 7 weeks out. I could afford to do that without panicking too much. And I thought, I'll do that, because I thought it'd be very hard to write this book while teaching it at the same time, or employing the principles of it exactly at the same time. So I don't want to get too drawn into how it works for one client. I wanted to give the whole broader thing. So, I mean, that was a tall order to write a book in 7 weeks. I appreciate that. But the thing is, I already had the blueprint with the proposal, and we didn't really move from that. And, I had been teaching this stuff and using this with clients. I had all these sort of like ad hoc, all over the place tools of like how to write a press kit, how to identify a story, what journalists really want. I had it everywhere, really. So in some ways it was a bit of an aggregation. But there was one week I wrote something like 40,000 words or something, and I thought that is, that's quite full on. But that's what I mean about when you're in the wonderful clear brain thing. It's kind of like supercharged sometimes, isn't it? Mm-hmm. So there was all those factors going on. So I wrote it and I delivered it to the deadline, and the publisher was like, she said something like, that was a punchy deadline, I think was her. And then it was really fantastic, because I really love collaborative writing, so it was a great thing to get the thing out of my head and all of that. But it was really nice to then work with a development editor, and I had some beta readers who were people I knew, and I really trusted their business sense. And the person who wrote the foreword to the book is a big she's got an MBE actually for services to entrepreneurship. She's a venture capital investor. So she had this really interesting perspective, which I could never have had, about why they look at media relations and media coverage and see that in a business, and see that, what the connection is between getting media coverage and getting investment. And she wrote the foreword to the book. So that was an amazing addition to have. So really, I think what I'm probably describing is lots of things kind of all sort of took off around about the same time. So it was a very intensive period of time. It was December. It all came to a bit of a head. I think the deadline was almost like Christmas Eve 2021. But yeah, and then it came out in June last year, 2022. Yeah,
and really well received. Has it helped you in terms of the development of your business as well? I mean, in terms of opening doors, and because people love people who can write a book, don't they? They love them to speak and talk and present things. I mean, what's it done for you?
It did help a lot. I mean, it's interesting how how when I've posted anything about the book. So yes, it was a finalist at the Business Book Awards in this startup and scale up category. Although it is media relations and anybody can use it, it was particularly targeted at helping founders sort of get their stuff going. So I was really pleased about that. That was a really nice thing to happen. And and it's been translated into Chinese recently. So whenever I post anything about this on LinkedIn, I get like masses of like reactions and things like that, which I think is really interesting, because I would say that the value posts about how to work with journalists or how to sort of like create communications are far more valuable. But I think there is something about a book, and it's the same thing with media coverage. There is something about the buzz of that. It does attract other people, and it's a big reason for doing it for that reason alone, not just for your own thrill, but it does create noise around you, and people just like that. I think because they can then sort of say stuff that they feel quite genuinely. They can say, "Oh, well done," because they're quite impressed by it without having to think of a response. It's quite easy to respond to these things. But I think the other thing that's been good about the book, one of the reasons I really wanted to do it, was I just felt, I don't know if this is something that kind of like the pandemic brought on a bit, and some stuff that was happening in my own life, but I just suddenly thought, God, like I know all this stuff, and if I don't put it down somewhere, that seems such a waste somehow. Like going back to what we were saying at the beginning about all the training, all that patience, all that effort that people put into me to learn these kind of fundamentals of asking the 6 questions and all that. And me, in the last few years, having seen how much that just transforms people, speeds up what they're trying to do in their communications, I thought, I just feel like I need to put this down somewhere. So that was a bit of a driving thing that was going on as well, I think. And it's certainly helped with, so if people approach me now and they want to work with me, but they have no budget, it's brilliant to be able to say, I've got a book, it's got everything in it, read it, and then, use it, and then later on come back if you want to. So it takes that whole, I have really enjoyed that I can then help. I've got something for everybody, as opposed to sort of just saying, I'm really sorry, but the fees start at this, and that's, and I know that they won't be able to pay it.
Okay, final question is, what are you up to sort of right now? And the book was done about a year ago. Is there anything that you're working on right now that you want to mention or that you're particularly excited about?
Yeah, well, I am doing something new. So one of the things that sort of happened is, it's kind of obvious that I do media relations for people and I help them work with journalists. But what sort of started to emerge through this work was that some of the skills that I used as a journalist were useful in a business, nothing to do with whether they wanted media coverage. They just wanted to be able to communicate complicated ideas in tight headlines to get their teams on board, so that, like, say, a big transformation strategy or a big new product or whatever would roll out more clearly inside the business, and then go out to the outside world. And that has been, I have really enjoyed that work. I've done some, now I'm sometimes do training modules on communication for some really quite large companies as part of their kind of like their leadership and development kind of like programs, so that their kind of up and coming managers have got some tools to help them communicate more effectively. And I'm doing a course so we're piloting this thing in September via an organization called IRM UK, which is like a big trainer and just conferences and all this kind of stuff for people working in the business change and analysis and transformation kind of space. And it's going to be like a 2-day course, and where I'll be passing on the skills that I had as a journalist to kind of crunch down breaking news and loads of change into kind of headlines, and then share them with other journalists so we could get the story straight and sort of interrogate it and scrutinize it, and then sort of send it on to our audiences, and so in the business world, like our stakeholders, I guess, and then deal with the kind of the backlash and the more information that comes in. And because it's a very, very dynamic situation, information communication, which I think is quite poorly understood in the corporate world. I think it's seen as a linear process where we have an idea and we communicate it out. But my kind of sense is the sort of breaking news environment is much more akin to what happens where you've got a ton of stuff you want to get out there, but you really do need to crunch it down so that people can just get their heads around what's the top line of this story, what are we actually doing, why are we doing it, what's happening. So again, the answers to these 6 questions, I guess. And then giving people the freedom to kind of, so it's one of the things I teach on this course, and I've been teaching at some conferences, is using this kind of these 6 questions as quite a neutral model, so that you can say, I don't know the answer to this in your meeting without the world falling in on your head and your bonus disappearing out of the door. Because in newsrooms, like, I think that the kind of irony of this is that journalists are really taking to task businesses all the time, and at Panorama, like, we're really challenging stuff, yet we would sit in our own meetings and we would be very honest and say, I don't know the answer to this. And it wouldn't be like, well, you should know it. It would be like, okay, how well can you go and find out by the end of the day, kind of thing. So I'm trying to sort of, I'm quite passionate about this at the moment, of sort of trying to transfer those skills into organizations, which kind of brings me a bit full circle. And I think in some ways why I exited journalism was I felt at Panorama proud, but then also uncomfortable about shining a light on things that were going wrong in organizations and were resulting in, say, losses of money or even life. And I sort of thought then, God, if only, people much earlier on in these organizations had a conversation about, like, the things they didn't know, they possibly could have avoided this snowball into this terrible thing and then Panorama kind of knocking on the door. But I felt a bit complicit in that, because one of the reasons people don't say they don't know is because they're very worried about journalists finding out and it all being exposed. So more and more now I'm sort of like getting into that kind of work where I'm helping people use those kind of tools to kind of communicate with each other and problem solve together, I guess, and find their story together and evolve the story together, because obviously it's changing, and take in the difficult questions and deal with them and then put out good answers. I do find that work very rewarding, because you can see the implications of that are not just like they get some great headlines, but that they may be, their whole business like takes off in a much more positive direction. And also for the thousands of people who work for them, it's a much better experience, because they understand like why the business is changing strategy, which is, very important.
Well, there's so much in what Felicity said there that I can really relate to. I love the stuff particularly about the 6 questions that can work for businesses as well as journalists. Always ask who, what, where, why, when, and how. She also talked about the art of forgiving yourself when those energy levels sag or things don't go quite your way, and why confusion can actually be a good thing to feel in business if you handle it properly. And as Felicity said at the end there's the way in which so many businesses can improve their understanding of how communication can make a big, big difference to their fortunes. So thank you, Felicity, and thank you to you too, the audience, for tuning in. If you enjoyed today's episode, we'd love for you to subscribe, rate and review through your usual podcast provider. And if you want to find out more about the Merri-Cast or our business Merrible Media, you can find us on LinkedIn. Don't forget to join us for our next episode. Until then, thanks for listening.